Down around old Heathcote town, just east of Bendigo, a big old grey box tree casts an eye. The sally fills the understory bright as sunlight's glow, as the silver eyes and the thornbills flitter by. This landscape, bruised and battered from 200 years of change, it holds secrets of a time lost somehow. One of Jarrah land, where Lowen dug and dingoes howled, the latter two here, just distant memories now. The gold rush came like bushfire, ringbark trees fell like the boughs of the red gums scattered on the old flood plains that made way for sheep and cattle, while fighting a losing battle, Rufus Betong soon were never seen again. When a man of English gentry, Professor Bennett was his name, found the woodlands to his aristocratic tastes. Many days he'd venture in, binoculars under his chin, he never let a single bird call go to waste. While at the old St Arnaud Inn over a couple pints of gin, Bennett and a bloke called Radford got to talking. Stealing horses was his game, but he'd give it all away to join Bennett in the woodlands, bird walking. So the two took up the mission. They'd survey birds near and far, from Dunolly to Shepparton and beyond. But they often sat and wondered if somehow they had blundered, a nagging feeling that something was wrong. It was a fine day on Mount Black, a billy boiling on the fire, Bennett and Radford sitting and peering across the land. So vast it was that suddenly, greeted by epiphany, the two men came to understand. We've been surveying these sites, but what of the stuff around them? Surely that affects our birds while on the wing. Radford furrowed his brow. It was all so clear now. To study landscapes, we must sample the whole damn thing. So they replicated landscapes, some cleared and some intact. They chose 24, just like a slab of beers. But this task was so gigantic that it made them rather frantic, and they ended up employing Gary Cheers. The data now collected, clean entered and inspected, Radford analysed the data set to show landscape properties are key. They drive bird diversity. Tree cover's critical. That much we now know. But far off in the distance, things were brewing catastrophic. The Aussie bush was in for one hell of a fight. A drought of new proportions would cause the region torsions and impress upon it would with all its might. This was not just thirsty country, it was truly polydipsic. The cockies lost their grain and cotton by the ton. The streams they ceased to flow in with nobody really knowing when an end to this old drought would finally come. The two bushies had become concerned. What would the drought mean for their birds? So they called up Cheers and planned a new survey. They'd go back to every site to check if everything's all right. Jim stole some horses and they left the next day. Now, creeping through the Sally, they met a drover called McNally, and they learned that he'd been surveying birds too. Jim offered him some horses, and the three men then joined forces. Combining data meant they'd see a trend or two. And then a fourth man, Jimmy T, fresh from a penal colony, he joined the gang with mathematics on his brain. He summoned Reverend Bayes, and then he analysed for days. As the four sat around a table, he explained. The birds we hold so dear are in grave trouble, I fear. The two data sets, they tell us of their plight. Half the species have declined, and adding to this slow grind, you know there is no end of this drought in sight. Bennett jumped upon his horse and made his way to Melbourne town. He would spread the word from Burrumbuttock to Homebush. This fight was getting dirty, so he appeared on 7:30, telling Kerry about the trouble in the bush. And then when least expected, finally a reprieve. The miserly skies they finally forgave. And they rained the bush for months, until that rain became a flood. The drought was broken, but had the birds been saved? So back into the bush again went those bushies with new friends who had taken up the task alongside them. Through flooded river banks and overflowing farmers' tanks, each site was surveyed, 4 times once again. The data were collated, and the team, they held their breath, wondering if the bush chorus had returned. Jimmy T got out his abacus and quickly did the numbers, and here's a summary of what we learned. The big wet had an effect, and it was clear to see that indeed there had been some recovery. Around a quarter of the species had recovered since the rain, so there was good news, or at least it seemed. But on the other hand, many species did not recover. 14 to 29% declined again. And so compared to the first days of the woodland bird surveys, around half species are scarcer than they were then. Well, such findings left despondent many members of the crew, but an answer they so desired. Jim offered to raise funds by stealing horses once again. Bennett appreciated the offer but declined. These birds are declining for reasons outside of our control. We can't stop the droughts or the flooding rains. But remember our whole landscapes, how their patterns change the birds? Maybe we can learn from them once again. We could look back at the data and ask whether, for example, landscapes with certain patterns retain more birds. Or perhaps landscape properties can hasten recovery or allow stable communities to form. Resistance we will measure as the proportion of species that a landscape retained during drought. Ranging from 0 to 1, I'm sure it can be done. This is something that we simply must find out. Resilience we will measure as the ratio of species found during drought compared to after rain. Landscapes with high resilience are able to bounce back, whereas those with little tend to stay the same. Stability is a coefficient of variation adjusted for bias caused by sample size. Communities that fluctuate score little on this scale, and those that change less, well, they score quite high. Next we asked, how does variation in these measures relate to landscape properties, such as composition, configuration and habitat extent, landscape context and primary productivity? Invoking Akayeki and multimodal inference, for each hypothesis we summed predictor weights. Productivity was supported as particularly important, so we best check out the parameter estimates. Effect sizes confirmed that landscapes with much tree cover positioned specifically on riparian strips tended to retain more species throughout the whole landscape, even when it was within a drought's firm grip. And when the drought had broken, we found the opposite effect. Those with less riparian veg bounced back more. But that's just because of need, as you don't need recovery if you retain most of your species before. High resistance, low resilience also led to high stability in landscapes with trees on moist and fertile soil. The mechanisms, likely many, food and water are aplenty. Microclimate also helps avoid the broil. But these benefits go on. You could write a bush poem about riparian strips and what they do. Disproportionately important for woodland bird conservation. They clean water, retain carbon and provide nectar too. So now with this directive we are saying in this world with increasingly intense droughts and flooding rains that we need to get revegetating on our riverbanks and perhaps our unique bird life can be saved. So next time you pass by a cleared floodplain or riverbank, plant some trees to show we have a choice. And you won't see it, you won't hear it, but I guarantee it happens. The old grey box of old Heathcote town will rejoice.